Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico Episode 34, Economic Development in Late Colonial New Mexico. So far in the series on the colonial period post the Pueblo Revolt in New Mexico, we've talked about how the military has changed, how the government has changed, even some of the routes New Mexico established to tie itself to the outside world. Today I want to talk about how their economy would change and develop during this period. Occasionally during this episode, I'll use the term vecino to refer to non-Native American settlers in New Mexico. As we've talked about a lot with these episodes on the bourbon reforms, let's lay out kind of what the issues the bourbon reforms are seeking to solve in New Mexico, as that'll allow us to kind of talk about what the economic situation looked a bit like. So the first major problem was the development and growth of industries within the province. The second is the lack of hard specie. And the third and final issue that we'll talk about is what the connections to New Mexico's outside world looked like. There were three major obstacles to development in New Mexico. The first will be the failure of the Spanish to convert the Pueblos. The second is the endemic raids of the middle to late 1700s. And the third is the lack of government investment in developing these industries. To start with that first one with the Pueblos, to quote from Settler to Citizen, quote, "The Franciscans in New Mexico faced a sophisticated system of cultural resistance among the Pueblos that allowed them to absorb foreign elements and yet not integrate them into the Indian worldview. According to anthropologists, Pueblo societies compartmentalized non-Pueblo elements, such as the body of Catholic teachings, and in this manner prevented the teachings from influencing traditional Indian patterns of belief," end quote. While by 1750, the networks of relationships built on coexistence of settlers and Puebloans had been reestablished, the Pueblos did what they could to control their interactions with the outside world. As we've talked about, from 1750 to 1780, raids in New Mexico would become endemic, and they would hinder the economic growth of the province by causing demographic changes such as concentrating the settlers in. The endemic raiding would even leave a cultural scar, such as the tradition of calling bad weather days a day of heretics, as these were the days that were favored for raids. Los Comanches, a play still performed in northern New Mexico today, dramatizes these interactions. While the Spanish would work towards peace in the late 1770s and early 1780s, that would culminate in the Comanche peace we've already talked about, it was quickly undermined by the smallpox epidemic that would strike in that same time period, and we'll talk about that shortly. Pottery would remain the primary industry of the Pueblos themselves. The pottery styles, though, would begin to change to reflect the target markets that the Puebloans were really selling to at the end of the day. Another change that would affect Pueblo pottery in the 1790s was a push to decorate churches. Pueblo artists would incorporate some of these styles that these churches would be decorated in, mostly Baroque, into their own works, but would still make them their own in their own unique Puebloan take on Baroque architecture. They also began to use bentonite slips starting around 1800 instead of the traditional rounded stones to prepare the vessel for firing. This would yield striations that were not present on previous pots. Heightened production volumes to meet market demands also yielded lower quality works in the areas that were producing this higher volume of work. Even some of the Pueblos on the edge of the Spanish world, like the Hopi Pueblos, would be affected by these changes. The Spanish were trying to achieve a goal of stabilizing New Mexico as a bulwark against incursions further south in the areas that were truly driving a profit for the Spanish crown's coffers. They did this in a two-part plan. The first part of this plan was military force and economic coercion of the hostile groups from without the empire, bringing them into heel to keep them from doing things like raiding. The other part of the plan was internal. It was to stimulate economic growth in the province to stabilize it from within. This would allow them to keep it both stable without and within and protect the areas to the south. From Galvez in 1781, who was the architect of this plan, quote, "Its conservation is so important that if we should lose New Mexico a second time, we'd have upon Vizcaya, Sonora, and Coahuila all the enemies who now invade that province," end quote. We've already talked about really the first part of that plan, which was the military side of things. So moving on to that second part to develop the economy in New Mexico, it would pretty much immediately hit a hitch. In 1780 and 1781, smallpox epidemics would begin to hit New Mexico. It could have come from a 1779 epidemic in Mexico City, or it could have been brought from the tribes along the Mississippi. Either way, it would make Spanish settlers the majority of the population in the colony. The smallpox epidemics would concentrate land and livestock, the wealth of the colony, in fewer hands, which would make it easier for them to do things like leverage the opportunities provided by the Comanche peace for economic development. The thing that made the epidemic as bad as it was in New Mexico was the previous relative isolation from smallpox of the population. lack of doctors, and slow communication, which allowed it to wreak havoc across the area. Inoculation would not arrive in New Mexico until 1805, and these epidemics would continue to break out throughout the period from roughly 1780 to 1805. In total, almost 28% of the population would die during these epidemics, or roughly 5,000 people. At times, it would nearly immobilize the presidial troops in New Mexico. As a result of these demographic changes as well, such as the Spanish now becoming the majority of the population, the missions would be reduced in numbers, although this would be short-lived as they would be increased again somewhat as the population started to bounce back. Tragically, the smallpox epidemic would mostly kill children. The friars themselves were also changing in this period. We've talked a little bit about how they started to align themselves more and more closely with the Spanish settlers rather than the pueblos. But they did have to buy all their own goods and pay for transport if they got them imported. The cost of this transport could be up to 8% of the total value of the goods, which would put quite a burden on the friars. Some pueblo crops were sown to help support the friars, and this seems to have been part of their total compensation. The pueblos seem to have sown their crops willingly, and this seems again to be a way that the pueblos drew a line in the sand where Spanish and pueblo interactions began. By the 1740s, though, the friars and secular officials were again charging each other of putting an undue burden on the pueblos. The friars charged that the governors were calling for too many crops to be planted for them, and the secular officials charged the friars with abusing the repartimiento and taking too many of the required servants of the pueblo as their own laborers. The maize for the governors probably totaled about 80.75 acres, which was a drop in the bucket compared to the total amount of pueblo land. The friars would use approximately 185 of the 295 pueblo servants that were used each week, or roughly 14 per pueblo. Due to the raiding, by 1779, the entire settlement patterns in New Mexico had changed. Many settlements were abandoned entirely. Governors had tried to concentrate the population into smaller, more defensible settlements, but as we've talked about in some previous episodes, it met with mixed success. The raids themselves also helped in some ways as it allowed for less encroachment on pueblo land from the Spanish as they were focused more on what can we defend rather than moving into these areas. And pueblos overall fared a little bit better as their farmlands radiated outwards from the pueblo rather than being placed apart from the land or from the home, which allowed them to use at least some of their fields even amongst this hostile raiding. The raiding also disrupted trade to the south as it was extremely dangerous to try and set out on a trade caravan. It would disrupt livestock that was meant for mining districts to the south, which would hurt how those mines would produce. The Comanche Peace, signed in 1786, essentially ended raiding in New Mexico, and that did set the stage for the economic growth for the remainder of the colonial period. The Comanche Peace itself was the crown jewel of Spanish foreign policy in New Mexico. From Settler to Citizen, quote, "The peace was the cornerstone of Galvez's strategy. Using the prospect of access to trade with the Indian pueblos and vecinos at established trade fairs, gifts of desirable trade items, and the implicit threat of an allied war against intransigence, Spanish officials forged a series of agreements that put New Mexico's adversaries at peace with the Pueblo and Vecino inhabitants, and with each other. Negotiations between the Comanche and Ute peoples closely followed the diplomacy surrounding the Comanche-Spanish peace, leading to a treaty agreed upon in early March 1786. On March 22nd, Governor Anza arranged a conference with the Navajo in order to begin the Hileno Apache. By the end of June, the Navajo had promised to show subordination and fealty to the Spanish king and to cooperate in expeditions against their recent Hileno allies. During sessions in which Governor Anza proposed the terms of the treaty, Comanche representatives addressed the council to promise retribution should the Navajo fail to live up to their word." End quote. Now, as we've talked about, to some degree, the Comanche peace itself may have also been the opposite, where the Comanches were really dictating the terms. Either way, the Spanish were able to use this peace to help bring other groups to the table. This pressure allowed for many alliances among the Spanish and the various people around them. The 1780s would bring relative peace compared to earlier periods. Again, we've kind of talked about some of this. And until this peace would last until 1821, when these alliances would begin to fall apart because of the newly independent Mexico, and it gave New Mexico the rest and breathing room it needed to begin growing and truly developing an economy and stabilizing itself internally. To tax or not to tax, New Mexico was an ongoing dilemma. The downsides of many of these taxes is that they would slow economic growth and would actually take coin out of the economy that the Spanish were trying to grow. In 1765, the Crown had tried to form a tobacco monopoly in New Mexico. The governor had disagreed because of the lack of hard currency in the colony, as we've talked about some of this as well. It would also require New Mexicans to quit growing punche, a local form of tobacco. The ban on punche was effectively impossible to enforce anyway, and even if it had been enforceable, New Mexicans ignored the ban. Eventually, the governor would compromise, and the revenues from this monopoly would be collected to some degree, and even though it wasn't a full monopoly, and these would help fund presidios and missions in New Mexico. In 1775, the alcalba, or royal sales tax, was to be applied to goods bound for New Mexico, but it would be suspended until 1780. After that, the records are sparse, but it appears that it was occasionally suspended again after that point. The Crown considered not charging a premium for libranzas, a type of deposit required of traders in the Northern Treasury, and this would become a policy not by benevolence of the Spanish Crown, but really more through necessity, as traders could not afford to make the libranzas needed. The government would try to reform the money supply, which would help with some of these issues with tax collection and allow for some collection of tax revenue. After 1768, the soldiers were paid in cash rather than getting goods from the quartermaster and then anything left over in actual pay. This had both been corrupt and had caused money to bog down in the economy. Part of the problem before this point in time was that a soldier had little control over the majority of his salary. Those awarded contracts to deliver goods to the presidios were also often cheated out of some of their promised payments due to this lack of hard currency among the Spanish and the northern frontier, and that would again make it harder to get a good contract. In 1772, the Spanish would create the new peso, a reform of their currency, but Nueva Vizcaya and New Mexico would both eventually become exempt from the deadline to exchange their old pesos for new. The Spanish would never fully be successful in overhauling the system in New Mexico to move fully away from the barter system, though, despite their best efforts. That would really start in the Mexican period, although some period earlier they did start to have money circulating. Overall, the Bourbon reforms would have profound changes in how New Mexico interacted with the Spanish crown, as we've kind of talked about. In 1765, 1774, 1779, and 1782, elk from New Mexico were captured for the Spanish Royal Zoo. Despite its existence at the edge of the Spanish world, the crown could exercise true power in New Mexico. Compared to before the Bourbon reforms were made, where the Spanish crown had authority on paper in New Mexico, but how enforceable that authority was negligible at best. The Bourbon reforms were trying out different proposals to fix identified problems. When this center-down approach failed was when officials did not have enough time to rethink solutions as part of a larger overall strategy for what they were trying to do. And an added benefit of this is that higher-up officials actually listened to lower-level responses to the proposed solutions and how they were going and took some of that advice instead. The final problem the Spanish were facing in bringing in together New Mexico to the rest of the empire and getting specie running and having an economy was interregional trade. To facilitate this trade, the Spanish funded trade expeditions to find new trade routes, such as what we've talked about with Anza's expeditions to California, as well as the Escalante and Dominguez expeditions to the west as well. Gold discoveries in Sonora would help incentivize connections between New Mexico and California. Overall, though, all these connections to Sonora, California, and other areas would fall through, and there were few expeditions from Spanish New Mexico to Spanish Illinois in 1792, but again, these also did not amount to much. The only real place the New Mexicans could trade with was Nueva Vizcaya and with outsiders. The Plains peoples and New Mexicans interacted with raids and trade fairs. We've already talked extensively about the raids, and we've talked to some degree about the trade fairs. The trade fairs were one of the two primary markets for local goods being traded outside of New Mexico themselves. The goods brought into New Mexico at these fairs were also desired goods in other parts of the Spanish Empire, which stimulated trade to the south to areas like Chihuahua. In 1754, Governor Cachupin would try to set trade values of the Plains people's goods, but this would meet with mixed success as to what prices both sides were willing to both accept and pay for these goods. For the most part, outside of Nueva Vizcaya, there were few good places for New Mexicans to trade. There were proposals to build some industries inside of New Mexico to again help stimulate the economy, but those would fall through. The Crown would build some things like barracks for the soldiers in Santa Fe, and these did have a marked effect on the economy in New Mexico. But overall, by the 1780s, merchants coming to New Mexico profited more from mastery of a complicated system of barter rather than coercion or even through just the value of the goods themselves. Some historians have alleged that merchants by the 1780s were profiting more from coercion of the people they were trading with as they held a monopoly on trade, and instead it was more through having a mastery of a complicated system of barter. The Pueblos would really no longer directly participate in trade caravans at this point as well, which meant they were producing less trade goods, which further hindered overall industry growth in New Mexico. By 1806, there were 2 trade caravans every year, though. Woven goods and sheep were the most common export goods from New Mexico to other parts of the empire. Sums would be set aside as well from these goods to handle the costs of war and gifts to the Indian allies around New Mexico. It's finally time we talk about how these merchants supposedly coerced New Mexicans into giving up more money than their goods were worth. From the 1770s to 1790s, imaginary monies were used to help transition from barter to specie. The following types of money would be created: the silver peso, worth 8 reals, the peso of enterprise, worth 6 reals, the old peso, worth 4 reals, and the peso de la tierra, or common peso, worth 2 reals. In Morphy's, one of Croix's advisors' views, merchants manipulated these values to fleece their customers. To quote from Morphy's report, quote, "A length of ordinary cloth, which is called a judía, costs the merchant 6 pesos. A settler needing to clothe himself buys it at a peso per yard, giving in place of pesos, pints of liquor. The piece, having 32 yards, costs him 32 pints of liquor. This miserable fellow then later goes to buy a pint of liquor at the same merchant who sold him the cloth for common pesos. But now the merchant tells him in all honesty he must sell the liquor by the silver peso, which results in the merchant getting in the long run 32 pesos for the original price of the cloth. From that 6 pesos, 4 reals are deducted, got handling and losses of liquor, leaving him a profit of 25 pesos 4 reals. The merchant makes collections at the end of the year. But this amount is not received in cash. It is charged to the account of the buyer against his future harvest of corn. This is an example of the usual way sales are made. Corn by the sack is worth 1 old peso and contains half a bushel of grain. On account of that, 25 pesos 4 reals by 25.5 bushels. These are then sold to the presidial troops of San Elizario, Principe, and Carrizal when they go to El Paso to purchase supplies of grain. And ordinarily they pay the merchant 20 reals, which means that he has made 64 pesos on that in the course of a year, if the figuring begins with his original cost of 6.5 pesos. On both the settler who sold him the grain and the soldier who bought it from him, he made a profit." End quote. In reality, this system was a way to integrate an internal system of barter where coin was scarce with a commercial export market built on hard currency. When considering the risks the merchant had to undertake to get the goods to and from its end destinations, it doesn't seem like undue exploitation to charge for the goods. The transformation of the peso into other kinds of currency reflects the merchant trying to translate the customary barter value of goods into something understandable by both sides. In the end, the merchant bought grain at market prices and then sold them for profit in a different market. However, if one did all the math in real pesos, there were no conversion fees charged to the buyer by the merchant, as the Spanish allege. There are no examples of this Perdón enterprise being used outside of Morphy's report to confirm that it even existed. As time went on, some items continued to operate on imaginary money, while others transitioned to using real money, though. And shortly after 1791, the peso de la tierra completely disappears from the historical record. One last note on the economy, as I've kind of mentioned throughout, is really the Mexican periods when money really starts to come into circulation. And some historians, especially the older ones, will note that there was no money in New Mexico prior to Mexican independence. As we've kind of seen, that's not really the truth. While there was little money and it was still majority a barter system, there was still some currency circulating through the economy. I've got a handful of episodes left before the next Q&A episode. If you have any questions on anything we've talked about up to this point, getting them in sooner rather than later will be the best way to ensure that I have time to research them before that episode. The best way to submit them is through the website at engineeringfire.org or the show's email, michael@engineeringfire.org. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. And thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.